Hi everybody. I took my walk this morning. Did you do some exercise? I think my hair is a little bit crazy. I need a haircut, but you know what? It's okay. We're all in this together, aren't we? And I've got my good friends here, George. Hello everybody. And Martha. Hi. And I'm going to read some more of their stories to you because I just love George and Martha. So the story I'm going to read right now is called The Picnic. Have you ever gone on a picnic? I used to love going on picnics when I was a girl. One Saturday morning, George wanted to sleep late. I love sleeping late, said George. But Martha had other ideas. She wanted to go on a picnic. Here she comes, said George to himself. Look at that. Martha's on her pogo stick. Did you notice that? Yeah. She's full of energy. Martha did her best to get George out of bed. Picnic time, sang Martha. Picnic time, let's go on a picnic. But George didn't budge. Martha played a tune on her saxophone. George put little balls of cotton in his ears and pulled up the covers. That George. Martha tickled George's toes. Stop it, said George. Picnic time, sang Martha. But I'm not going on a picnic, said George. Oh, yes, you are, said his friends. Look at her tickling his big toes. She's so silly. Martha had a clever idea. This is such hard work, she said, huffing and puffing. But I'm not going to help, said George. I'm getting tired, said Martha. Look what she did. She just pushed his bed right out of the house. I bet she was tired. But you know what? George had fun on the picnic. I'm so glad we came, said George. But Martha wasn't listening. You know what happened to Martha? She had fallen asleep. I wonder why. Story number 4. The Scary Movie. Have you ever gone to a scary movie? Martha was nervous. I've never been to a scary movie before. Silly goose, said George. Everyone likes scary movies. Oh, I hope I don't faint, said Martha. Whoa. Martha liked the scary movie. This is fun, she giggled. Martha noticed that George was hiding under his seat. I'm just looking for my glasses, said George. You don't wear glasses, said Martha. Who do you think was really scared? When the movie was over, George was as white as a sheet. Hold my hand, George said to Martha. I don't want you to be afraid walking home. Thank you, said Martha. And look at George. Who do you think really got scared in that movie? I think George did. And this one, the last story, actually there's more stories, but it was the last story in this one little book. It's called The Secret Club. Have you ever had a club? When I was in 8th grade, we formed a club called the Blue Angels, and we liked to do things to help other people. And it was a lot of fun. Where are you going, George? Asked Martha. Oh, I'm going to my secret club, said George. I'll come along, said Martha. Oh, no, said George. It's a secret club. But you can let me in, said Martha. No, I can't, said George. And he went on his way. Do you know Martha? She was furious. What does it mean to be furious? That's right. You feel real angry. When George was inside his secret clubhouse, Martha made a terrible fuss. You let me in, she shouted. No, said George. Yes, yes, cried Martha. No, no, said George. I'm coming in whether you like it or not, cried Martha. Ooh, that Martha was determined. When Martha saw the inside of George's clubhouse, she was so ashamed. You old sweetheart, she said to George. George smiled. I hope you've learned your lesson. I certainly have, said his friend. And look what his secret clubhouse was about. Can you read that? It says the Martha Fan Club. George is the president. He didn't want her to know about it. What a good friend George was to Martha. Really, really one of the best friends. And this book is another one about Abraham Lincoln. It's called Mr. Lincoln's Boys, being the mostly true adventures of Abraham Lincoln's troublemaking sons, Tad and Willie. I like Mr. Lincoln. One night, long ago in the White House, a very little boy was having a very bad dream. Tad sat up in bed, clutching his blanket. "You awake, Willie?" he said, shaking his brother. "Am now," Willie grumbled. "Go back to sleep, Tad." But Tad couldn't sleep, so he did what he always did when he was afraid. He went to his father. Have you ever had a bad dream? I have. President Lincoln was working late, reading telegrams. He stretched out his long legs under his desk and sighed. Tad scrambled up his father's legs like a monkey climbing a coconut tree. The boy squirmed into his lap. "I dreamed everybody was fighting each other. It made no difference whether they were friends, even brothers. A war between the North and the South. Do you think that's what my dream means, Pa?" he asked Mr. Lincoln. "You believe in dreams, Taddy?" "Well, sometimes." "Is there really going to be a war?" Well, Tad's father was a very busy man, and he was worried too, but his boys brought a twinkle to his eye. "I hope not," he said, mussing Tad's hair. "I hope it won't come to that." But Tad's dream came true, and the country was torn apart to a civil war. Oh, look how comfortable he looks in his dad's lap. The year 1861 was a strange, sad time to be a boy in Washington, D.C. Northern soldiers were everywhere, guarding the city from invasion by Southern rebels. Some Northern troops even camped at the White House where the Lincoln family lived. Colonel Elmer Ellsworth's fire zouaves, burly firemen from New York who practiced acrobatic military drills, arrived ready to fight for the Union. They were wearing fiery red and blue uniforms. They marched down Pennsylvania Avenue shouting, "1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, Tiger Zouave!" Big ugly guns on carts rolled through the streets with a terrible rumbling. Oh, like thunder. I'm sorry. Look at that picture of all those brave soldiers in the city. One day, Tad and Willie were chasing their pet goat on the White House lawn when she stopped in her tracks and pricked up her ears. You see that little goat there? "Pa says there's a battle across the river in Virginia," Willie said. "Hear that noise like slamming doors, Tad? That's big cannons going off. You bet." Tad shivered. Soon, Northern soldiers, tired and hungry, dragged themselves back to Washington from the battle. Their eyes stared from mud-streaked faces. When they heard the crowd's cheers, the men started marching with a spring in their step. But some children's fathers wore bandages and limped or had to be carried to hospital beds, and other fathers didn't come back at all. No, it wasn't an easy time to be a boy in Washington, D.C., especially if you were the president's sons, with your pa carrying the weight of the war on his soldiers like some big old cannonball. Mr. Lincoln's face got a new worry wrinkle every day, and wherever his sons went, strangers pointed at them. "I wish they wouldn't stare at us so," Willie said. "Wasn't there ever a president who had children?" But Willie and Tad found ways to be ordinary boys. They loved to pull clever pranks. Tad was 2 years younger, but he was the ringleader. He would dare Willie to do something, and Willie would go along with it. Like the time they rigged all the signal bells in the attic to ring at once. Servants rushed up and down the stairs, wondering who had called them. Old Edward, the doorkeeper, opened the door, and no one was there. The bells were bewitched. Mr. Lincoln's secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay, ran to the president's office. They feared it was a great national emergency. When they found out the truth, they were furious. But you know what the president did? He just laughed. People said the Lincoln boys were out of control. Mr. Hay wanted to wring their little necks and toss them out his window. The army officers felt the same way. Imagine old General so-and-so trying to talk to the president about troops and provisions and battle plans, and there were Willie and Tad, one on each of Mr. Lincoln's knees. His sons chattered and teased. They bounced up and down like toy boats. They pinched the president's cheeks and they pulled his long nose. They laughed and squealed until the poor old tired general finally said, "Mr. President, can't you do something about those rascals?" But whenever anyone complained about his sons, Mr. Lincoln just smiled and said, "Let the children have a good time." I don't think he wanted them to worry about the war, do you? Sometimes Tad and Willie played soldier, but to Mr. Lincoln's boys this was no game. Being soldiers was serious business. They wore zouave uniforms like the men in their brave friend Colonel Elmer Ellsworth's regiment. Colonel Ellsworth had gotten killed capturing a rebel flag in Virginia. For the Lincoln boys, wearing the zouave uniform became one way of remembering him. Elmer would have been proud of his young friends. They drilled the White House servants like army troops. Willie was the colonel and Tad was the noisy drum major. They named themselves Mrs. Lincoln's Zouaves, and they manned a toy cannon on the roof of the White House, keeping a keen eye out for rebel troops. "Let 'em come," said Drum Major Tad. "Willie and I are ready for them." Sometimes Tad took guard at the bottom of the grand staircase in the White House. When visitors came to see the president, he blocked their way. "Halt! 5 cents, please," he'd say. "It's for the Sanitary Commission." That was a charity to help soldiers like today's Red Cross. Once the visitors paid up, Tad let them pass. Wow, they thought of a lot of things, didn't they? One day, Mrs. Lincoln and her young friend Julia, who often kept an eye on the children, heard off-key music coming through a window at the White House. "What in heaven's name is that noise, Julia?" Mrs. Lincoln asked. "It's probably the Dead March," she replied. "I suppose the boys are burying Jack again." Jack was the boys' soldier doll. He wore a tiny zouave uniform and always seemed to be getting into trouble. One week they'd catch him spying for the enemy. The next they'd accuse him of deserting his post. Earlier that morning, Willie and Tad had put Jack on trial for the 10th time. "You deserve no mercy," Tad had said to Jack in a deep judge's voice. "I hereby sentence Private Jack to death by the firing squad." They took Jack outside the White House and propped him against a wall. The boys tied a tiny blindfold on him. "Ready? Aim," Tad ordered. They squinted in the bright light and aimed another cannon at Jack. "Fire! Kapow!" Jack was no more. Willie played a sad melody on a broken fiddle, then blew mournful notes on a banged-up horn while Tad beat a drum. They shuffled slowly by the White House in the funeral procession. Tad dug a grave for Jack in Mrs. Lincoln's rose garden. Then Willie placed a single rose on Jack's coffin and shed a tear. Together the boys were lowering Jack's coffin into the graves when suddenly, "Stop there!" shouted Major Watt, the gardener, running furiously toward them. The boys' pet goat got so riled up she chased after the gardener. Major Watt stared at the big hole the boys had dug among the rose bushes, then glowered at Willie and Tad. Get, he shouted at them, waving his arms like he was shooing flies. The boys grabbed Jack's coffin and started running. "You set foot in that garden again and I'll put a hickory switch to your bottoms." Whoa, that sounds serious. Willie and Tad pounded up the White House stairs to the second-floor offices. Mr. Nicolay tried to grab them as they flew by, but they were too quick for him, and the boys paraded into Mr. Lincoln's office and saluted like good soldiers. Mr. Hay was talking with the president, but the children ignored him and plopped right down on the desk. He tugged nervously at his collar, muttering, "Not again." Mr. Lincoln clasped his big bony hands behind his back and paced the floor. He looked at his secretary with a question in his eyes. Mr. Hay shook his head. Mr. Lincoln paused, then took a blank piece of paper from his desk drawer. "I will be his friend," he said, dipping his pen into the inkwell. "The doll, Jax, is pardoned by order of the President, A. Lincoln." That means he forgave him of any wrongs he had done. The boys shouted, "Hooray!" and they waved the pardon in the air like a flag. Joining hands, they danced around their father, singing a song about old Abe Lincoln. Then they all fell wrestling on the floor. Tad and Willie laughed and tried to hold Mr. Lincoln down. Finally, he broke free and he stood up, and the children galloped out and chased each other down the hall like frisky goats. As Mr. Lincoln watched them go, the light seemed to go out of his eyes. He brushed off his long sleeves and sighed. Mr. Lincoln picked up the doll Jack, which the boys had left behind. You know, John, he said to his secretary, it makes me feel rested after a hard day's work to find some good excuse to save a man's life. The president put his arm around Mr. Hayes' shoulder and tossed some papers into his tall stovepipe hat. Come on, John, he said, putting his hat on his head. Jack and I will walk you home. Anyway, they had a lot of fun with their dad, who just was down to earth and didn't always want to be burdened with the troubles of the war and everything that was going on in the country. It was wonderful. He took time for his sons. Well, good night, everyone. One kiss. Should I do another one? That's for Owen. Another one for Owen. This is for everyone else. I love you.
Amen.